So, as we start this beautiful little story, it's a real gem of a story shining in a dark time of the history of God's people. We just need to understand the context a little bit before we get into the story. It's set in about 1300 BC. In the days, it says at the beginning of the book, in the days when the judges ruled, and it comes just after the book of Judges. And so that's its context. And the stories of the judges are chaotic, they're nightmarish, sometimes horrific. What we see there is that evil reigns in the culture of the people of God. They rebel against God's love, and they suffer all the consequences of doing that. And then they cry out again to God, and he sends a leader who's filled with the Holy Spirit to rule over them, and peace is established. And then the leader dies and it starts all over again. So in the opening verses of Judges chapter 2, verse 10 says this: another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. And then a few verses later, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. But they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. And when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following their gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways. And that describes the culture in which Ruth is set. By the end of the book, we're told, book of Ruth that is, we're told that a king is coming. And it's King David, there in the genealogy at the end of the story of Ruth. And that's the great turning point that Ruth gives us from the darkness of the time of Judges through looking forwards to a king, King David himself. But King David, of course, points to the greater king, the king who will never die, King Jesus. And that's the context of this beautiful little story. So here, right at the start, we see the nation's leadership is in disarray. The people can't look to the government of their day for godly leadership. So where do ordinary people turn when the world's in a mess? Well, this is so often the picture in the Bible of when God acts. It isn't when all is going well and everything is comfortable. It's in times of worry and anxiety. And he doesn't work predominantly through the government of the day or the powerful leaders of the church of the day. What we see in the pages of the Bible is he comes to ordinary people, an ordinary family, with all their worries and concerns that you and I would have. And he works through ordinary Naomi and ordinary Ruth. But in God's eyes, Naomi is vital to his plan, and so is her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And in their culture, a culture where women didn't have any power, a culture which was patriarchal, male-dominated, God chooses two insignificant women, insignificant in the eyes of the world, two women to carry out, or to carry forward his great works of salvation. I wonder if you ever think to yourself, well, these stories of the people God uses are amazing, but it's never going to use me. They're all gifted and talented, they're well educated or connected, but that's not me. Or I'm too old to be used by God now. God will use younger people, people who are connected, are talented. But the story of Naomi and the story of Ruth say the exact opposite to the way we think, as do most of the stories in the Bible, actually. God doesn't always use the talented, the connected, the educated. In fact, more often than not, he uses the poor, the unconnected, the small. God will use people who are available, people who are faithful, people who are small in their own eyes to do his plans. And that's the story of Ruth and Naomi. So as we go through it, please don't ever think that you're too old, too small, too insignificant, not talented enough to be used by God. Take great encouragement from these words, because these are ordinary people who God uses in extraordinary ways. But as the day starts in this story, we could say, and it's like, and I look out of my window, it's cloudy and grey. And if it starts out cloudy and grey, by the end of verse 5, it's stormy and black. There's lightning and thunder. In fact, you could call this first sermon in the series 3 funerals and a famine. Naomi goes from having a husband and 2 sons and their wives to losing her husband and her sons and still facing famine. How quickly life can fall apart. It turns, doesn't it? In a moment, as the result of a phone call or a decision or a conversation with the doctor, how quickly life can change. But at the start of the story, it starts with a decision that Elimelech and Naomi make that probably seemed like a good one to them at the time. There was famine in the land, we're told. There's often famine in the stories of the Bible that leads to a decision on which the key events pivot. You can imagine Naomi and Elimelech sitting in bed one night with a cup of tea, talking it through what they should do. And one says to the other, "What should we do, darling? The boys are hungry. We're living here in Bethlehem, called the place of bread." And that's ironic, isn't it? There's no bread, and there's no pasta, there's no tin tomatoes, the shelves are bare in the supermarket. There's not even any toilet roll. Well, says Elimelech, God helps those who help themselves. Come on, let's think it through. Let's use our common sense. Let's use our understanding. There's food in Moab, so let's go to Moab. The prospects are better there. And it seems sensible, doesn't it? But Elimelech, his name means God is king. And Israel has been told by God that Moab was off limits. And if God is king, Moab is not an option. And Naomi might have sat there in bed that night and said, "Well, that's all well and good, darling, but shouldn't we trust in the Lord with all our hearts and lean not on our own understanding?" And Elimelech may have turned around and said, "Oh, Naomi, you're so spiritual about things all the time. Well, we've got to do something." And in that decision, they pack the car, they hook up the trailer, they put the boys in the back, and off they go to Moab. It's understandable, it's sensible. But God has said that's not right. I wonder if you, like me, look back on our lives and we can see there are times when we've made good decisions, but if we're honest, there have been decisions that we've made when we reflect upon them, when we might have done things differently. Maybe we've even knowingly gone against God's will at times because it seemed practical or it seemed to fit what society was saying better. But later we wish we hadn't. The wonderful thing about the story of Ruth is it's an exposition on that verse that we looked at in Romans 8 a couple of weeks back. You know it well. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. Even if this decision was the wrong decision, God sweeps it in to his purpose. And the story continues. And it could have been called 3 funerals, 2 weddings, because sadness comes straight away. Elimelech dies, but then things seem to go better. Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion, meet Ruth and Orpah, and there's wedding bells. And then Naomi's just waiting for the pitter-patter of little feet. But they never come. And tragedy strikes again. Mahlon and Chilion die. And Naomi must have wondered what's gone wrong. Was this God's judgment for coming back to Moab? And she must have had so many questions going around in her broken heart. But the famine ends back home, and she gets news, and 10 years has passed. And so she decides to return home with her girls, her daughters-in-law. She's a broken woman. She says to her friends and neighbors when she gets home, I went out full. I had a husband, I had sons, I had so much going on, but I've come back empty. I'm a widow. And she says to her friends and neighbors back in Bethlehem, don't call me Naomi, which means delight, but call me Mara, which means bitterness. Life did not work out the way she hoped. And often it doesn't it? But it's amazing, isn't it? That the focus of God in this story is on the domestic circumstances of a lonely widow. There are no great battles. There are no great leaders being dethroned. This story is about the ordinary life of an ordinary family and faith in the midst of it. Not always high and great faith, but ordinary faith in the midst of the ups and downs of life. But on her way home with her two daughters-in-law, we hear a conversation. And in this conversation and in the decisions made here, we see three examples of faith, three different pictures of what faith can look like in the decisions that we make, in how we live our lives. Somewhere on the road, on the way home, she turns to her daughters-in-law. And I think in a great act of compassion and selfless love, she says, in effect to her girls, she says, look, I'm all washed up, girls. And she gives a great picture of the Levitical law of marriage and how there doesn't seem to be much hope for her. There's nothing for you if you come back to Bethlehem with me, she says. It'd be far better for you if you go back to Moab. You might find husbands there and start families for yourself. And she urges them. And she uses a beautiful phrase as she speaks to them. She says this, she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you. And that little word kindly is the Hebrew word hesed, which means covenant love. May the Lord show you his covenant love, she says to them. She's not lost her faith in God. Alec Mathieu, a wonderful Bible teacher, says that word hesed means it combines the warmth of God's fellowship, he says, with the security of God's faithfulness. Isn't that wonderful? The warmth of God's fellowship with the security of God's faithfulness. And Naomi's faith here is a conflicted faith. On the one hand, she trusts God. She believes God's covenant love is still there in spite of all her circumstances. And she wishes it on her daughters-in-law. She gives it to her daughters-in-law. But on the other hand, she believes her future's over. The Lord's hand has turned against me, she says. It's a conflicted faith. She has faith for others, but not for herself. Isn't that so often the way? That it's easier to have faith in God for others than it is that God might do something in our lives. And at this point, Naomi's faith is there, but it's conflicted. Orpah, well, she hears Naomi's speech, and there's floods of tears, isn't there? She makes a decision in that moment. And that's what faith is. It's based on decisions that we make. She makes a decision in that moment. And in that moment, she says goodbye. She decides that Naomi's right, that she'd be better off in Moab. And in floods of tears, mascara pouring down their faces, screwed up little tissues and runny noses, no social distancing at all. They embrace, they say goodbye to each other. And Orpah goes to Moab. Has Orpah's faith gone? We don't know. But she leaves Naomi and Ruth and goes back to Moab. And then the spotlight turns on Ruth. And we see this third picture of faith in this beautiful statement, one that you may well know. If you know the story of Ruth at all, you'll know this statement by her. And with, I imagine, tears streaming down her face, Ruth turns to her mother-in-law and she says these beautiful, beautiful words in verse 16 and 17. Do not urge me to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more, if anything but death parts me from you. Isn't that beautiful? In other words, Naomi, nothing is going to separate me from you. Wholehearted, unshackled devotion. Come what may, I will never leave you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. And it's not just a commitment to Naomi, it's a commitment to the Lord. Your God will be my God. She was from Moab. They didn't even worship Yahweh there, but she's been converted. Maybe by Naomi's selfless act of love. But her faith now is wholeheartedly in the God of the Bible. And her devotion is not only to her God, but also to his people. So let me ask you as we close. In your everyday life, what does your faith look like? I'm not talking about your Sunday faith. I'm talking about your Tuesday morning faith, your Thursday afternoon faith, the decisions that you make when the phone calls come and there's that sad news, or where a decision has to be made about where to go for the future, what to do. Where is your faith? Is it like Naomi's that's conflicted? You'd sort of trust God, but not for yourself? Is it like Orpah's? You'll do the sensible thing? Or is it like Ruth's, where the decision may not seem sensible, but you will trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding? And you'll devote yourself not just to the Lord, but to his people as well. Amen.